For the legs, I had ripped each of my boards down to 6 inches wide, and for the stretchers, I ripped them down to 5 inches wide. Again, you can use dimensional lumber. If you want them 6 inches, you're probably going to have to do a 1x8. And for the stretchers, again, I wouldn't go any smaller than a 1x8, because then you're going to start running the risk of having inferior lumber. On each one of these 8-foot long boards, I'll cut one board that is 33 inches long and 2 boards that are 30 inches long. Now, depending on how tall you are, you might not want your bench to be 34 inches off the ground like me. How I measure the proper height of a bench is I stand nice and straight. I put my arms down at my sides and kind of lift my hands so that the palms of my hands face the ground. If you can take a tape measure and measure to the bottom of your hand, that'll be about the right height that you want. Whatever height bench you want, you'll take your legs later on and cut those 1 inch shorter than that, because your tenon's going to be 3 inches and your bench top is 4 inches. So if you want your bench to be 32 inches tall, you'll end up making your legs 31 inches tall. Then you'll still have your stretchers 3 inches from the ground, and it shouldn't affect anything except for the sliding dead man. And again, you'll just adjust that sliding dead man based on the height between the stretcher and the bottom of the workbench. Here I'm just making a quick little guide so that I can glue these pieces up and get a nice perfect 3 inch tenon sticking out of the top, and the shoulders on each side will be nice and square. So I basically just will cut out the middle there, which is the same width of that board, and it's 3 inches deep. So when I glue my 3 pieces together, I'll slide that on the top, slide the 2 outside pieces so that they touch that little guide, and then glue it up at that point. Now, another little trick with gluing up is if you take a pinch of salt in your hand and kind of sprinkle it over the glue area, that'll prevent those boards from wanting to slip and slide on you. When you get a lot of glue on the wood and you try clamping it, a lot of times it really wants to tend to slide on you. If you just a little sprinkle of salt, don't do a lot, a little sprinkle will help keep that wood from sliding around, and you can see I end up getting a nice straight across shoulder line. So to make my stretchers, I take 4 of those boards that I've ripped down to 5 inches wide, and I screw a stop block to my bench top at the exact distance that I want for that stretcher, and I'll cut the long stretcher out of each of those boards, and it'll give me a couple feet, probably almost like 4 feet of extra scrap that I'll move my stop block after I cut the 4 long stretchers. I'll move the stop block and cut the 4 short stretchers out of those scrap pieces. Then I'll glue both sets of short stretchers and both sets of long stretchers at the same time. Again, I use a little bit of salt to help keep them nice and straight. These pieces are the exact same length because I'll be cutting the tenons out of those. Since they're only 2 pieces wide, I can't use a middle piece like I can on the legs, which are 3 pieces wide, to make the tenon. So these ones will actually have to cut the tenon out. Here you'll also notice that I'm putting glue on both faces, which is always ideal in my opinion, instead of gluing just one face. On the bench top, I glued just one face, You can, if you're careful and kind of practice it out, glue both faces of each board, which I would recommend doing if you can. It's just that much more glue and more insurance that you'll get good glue adhesion. Once the glue dries, I can take a clamp and clamp it to my workbench to serve as a planing stop, which is really nice. That's why you build the bench top first, and then you can assemble and build all your other pieces on it. Now I use a hand plane to just kind of smooth off the edges and make sure things are square. Things shouldn't be too out of square if you're careful with your glue up. So I'm just basically knocking off the glue and getting a nice smooth surface. Now this is where I'll cut my legs to their final height. Again, I'll measure everything out, bring it over to my saw, drop my saw down, and get it right on the line, and then I'll screw in a stop block so that I can get consistent cuts on all 4 legs. So here again, if you don't want your bench to be 34 inches tall, then you need to alter the height here. So basically whatever height you want your bench, just subtract an inch, and that should be the height that you need to cut your legs at. If you don't have a miter saw that can cut all the way through this 4 and about 1/2 inches, then you can cut halfway through on one side, turn the board 90 degrees, cut a little bit on that side, turn it all the way over, and finish the cut. If your miter saw is not square though, you'll probably end up with a little bit of off-center cuts, which isn't a huge deal. You can just kind of sand that stuff out. Next, on my stretchers, I'm going to lay out and cut the tenons. So just follow the plans for these measurements here. I use a square and a marking knife to cut a knife line on the shoulders. Now you can use a table saw or a band saw or any method that you want for cutting these. I tend to like to use hand tools for my joinery, but use whatever method that you're most comfortable with and feel the most confidence in. Even on these long pieces, you can still use the workbench to clamp your work to it to make these cuts. Now, if, like I'm recommending, not to build the bench with those chops on there yet and glue those on later on, you can just use a longer clamp across the top to still clamp this to the surface so that you can saw your tenons. You can even just lay those stretchers on the top of the bench and then just kind of crouch down to cut the tenons as well. Rubbing some wax on both your hand planes and your saws will drastically reduce the amount of effort it takes to push them through wood. It works like a charm. And that's just an old candle that I grabbed from inside the house, and it's lasted me a really long time. It works good, but something like paraffin wax or something like that will work as well. So I basically just use a Western back saw on this one, but you can use the Japanese saw or whatever. I just kind of like to switch it up a lot, and I cut my shoulders. Then I'll take my marking gauge and add the lines for the inside shoulders of the tenon and cut those with the Western saw first, being really careful not to scar any of the long edges. And once I cut that, I'll take my Japanese saw and cut all the way down to the middle. One of the cool things about these Japanese saws is if you look at the very end, how it's kind of cut away. So when you get really close to your end, if you just kind of run the tip of the saw through there, you won't end up cutting too far and scarring one of your opposite faces. Then I'll just take a chisel, and I also show using a hand plane or a rasp and kind of chamfer all the edges of the tenon, because when you're chopping out your mortise later on and then you're trying to drive your tenon in, there's a chance that something could get wedged in there or you didn't cut it perfectly. So if you chamfer the edges a little bit, it'll kind of just give space for any extra debris or material that you didn't remove to hide in there, and you'll still be able to seat your joint properly. Now I'm demonstrating here a couple different methods of tuning the tenon if you didn't get the tenon cut perfectly with the saw. Now if you're using like a table saw or a router or a bandsaw, you could probably get really consistent, not need to do any tuning. But if you're using hand tools, you might need to do some tuning. So you can have either a router plane. Now you can make a router plane. There's planes online. If you don't have one, I'll have one. They're kind of harder to find. You can use a shoulder plane, you can use a regular plane and a chisel, and then you can use even these rasps, which I like a lot. They do a really nice job of flattening stuff. So there's a lot of different ways to tune your tenons. Just be really nice and careful and get them nice and flat. Try not to leave a lot of voids and divots in them, because you want that nice wood-to-wood glue surface so that the chemical reaction in the wood glue can actually work. So with the legs, the center of the tenon is created by that center piece of wood. So now all we have to do is cut off the outside face of each tenon, and then you have your proper shoulders. So I have all my posts marked out A, B, C, D. I look at each individual post and pick out which face that I want on the outside. If there's any kind of defects or issues that I had with a post, maybe I screwed up and caused a bruise or something like that, I'll lay those posts out so those will kind of be hidden. Anyway, here's my B post, and this is the face. And down here is my stretcher that's going to run across this side of the bench, and it's marked B top. So when I'm laying out this mortise, I also mark out on all the posts where the mortises are going to be. So it's going to be, since I want this flush with out here, that mortise is going to kind of be inside. And on the other face, the back end, there's another X down there. That's where the shorter stretcher will go across. So make sure that you lay out, mark out all your posts, mark out which stretcher and which tenon of that stretcher is going to be going into each post. And I like to use my tenons to mark out my mortises. Instead of like trying to measure this, I'll lay this on top of there and actually use that as my guide to lay out. So you can see I have the legs laid out with the stretcher running across the middle, and I have them lined up. This is the 3-inch mark. I made a little line because I want the stretcher to be 3 inches up from the bottom of the foot to give space for your feet to go underneath there. So I line it up at 3 inches, and now I will make marks along the tenons here so that I get the exact thickness that I need, height, for the mortises. I'm using a chisel to transfer these marks here because I can register the flat face of the chisel on that flat side of the tenon to get my mark. I just make a little mark here, and then later on I'll take my square and the marking knife and extend that line all the way across the bottom of that mortise. Then I'll set my mortising marking gauge, and if you don't have one of these, I would recommend trying to get one. I'll register the face of the marking gauge on that stretcher, and then I'll drop it down to the far side of the tenon, and I'll drop the other wheel to the near side of that tenon. And then when I take it over to my leg and register against the face of the leg, it'll mark out that mortise so that when the stretcher is inserted into the leg, the face of that stretcher will be flush with the face of the leg, if that makes any sense. But basically, I'm just using the stretcher to set the marking gauge. Here's where I'm extending those lines that I made with the chisel a little bit earlier. Then I'll take my legs over to the drill press and drill out the majority of the waste here, and then chop the mortises with a chisel. So the two legs that are on the Nicholson side of the bench are half lap jointed to that apron. So what I do is I basically take the thickness of one of the boards and divide it by 2 for the half lap, and I'll set my table saw just shy of that and make a bunch of cuts with a miter gauge at 90 degrees. You could use a crosscut sled if you have one. Then I'll take a chisel and knock all those pieces out. Now if you wanted to put a dado stack in there, or if you actually wanted to take the table saw and cut it all out on the table saw, just move it over the width of the blade each time, by all means you can do that too. But I just kind of did it in about 1-inch passes, and then I took it over to my bench where I chiseled away with a large chisel and used some of my shoulder planes and hand planes to flatten it. I guess you could also use a router and even potentially a bandsaw to cut that out. So whatever you feel comfortable with, by all means use that. Then I just add some chamfers to the bottom of the legs, and I'm done with all the joinery on the legs, and I can move on to the next part.